Welcome to the Studio Art Department at Bethany Lutheran College. Bethany is a special place for artists. Here we learn to witness in a visual culture and become good stewards of our God-given talents. So today I want to take you through the steps of transferring a masterpiece from computer to printout to drawing to your canvas so that you can do a painted copy of a Renaissance portrait. So just some advice about your internet search. I just typed in Leonardo portrait and it got me I guess some standard Google image results, but I do want to make you aware of this tools toggle here, which allows you to choose the size. Usually it'll come back with any size, and I recommend narrowing your search to large size documents so that you've got higher resolution results. Okay, and then when you open that up, one of the best places to really get good results is Wikipedia and the Wiki Commons. You can pay attention to the resolution of the image that you open. This larger size is super high resolution. It's ginormous, and I don't want to go that far, so I took the next size down. It's about 1,000 pixels tall, and that should be fine for our purposes. Okay, so then I just take this and print it, and I printed it in black and white. So make sure that you're paying attention to your settings. Print it out in black and white and make sure that it fills out the whole paper. Standard paper size is just fine. Okay, so here I am at the drawing table, and I've got some tools set out and some supplies. I've got my printout from the computer, black and white printout, full page. And here's some of the things we're going to use. Standard pencil, you don't have to get fancy. If you have nicer pencils, that's fine. I've got some markers here with relatively fine points. The purpose of the marker is to draw a grid over the top of this printout. So choose your tool there so that it will show and not obscure too much of the image. You have some alternatives there. If you can find maybe a white charcoal pencil or a skinny chalk, that would do a fine job too. Just test it out, make sure that it actually covers the printer ink. I've got a few erasers here, kind of a regular eraser, and then this kneaded rubber stretchy eraser that might be handy later on. And I have a couple sticks here of vine charcoal. This is a very cheap, economic vine charcoal. It's really just a burnt stick. If you look closely at it, you can see the wood grain. We'll be using that for our transfer process later. You'll also need a ruler, something that will span the printout, but then also the canvas that we're going to work on later. So I've got a 24-inch ruler here. That's going to take care of the amount of space that I need. You're going to have maybe a different situation. And then I've got a piece of paper here, and this is nothing real special. I would say you make sure that the paper isn't too thick. You don't want a heavy watercolor paper or a Bristol board or something. You don't want a poster board or something that thick. Because we're going to kind of trace through this, we need to be able to put pressure through this to transfer our drawing to the canvas. So nothing too thick. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so I've started to grid my printout here. You can see there's some green marks along the perimeter, and all I've done is taken my ruler at the edges. I line up the 0 on my ruler with the edge of the print, with the edge of the ink, and then I made green marks every 1 inch. And very importantly, I've done the same thing across the bottom, and I started at the same edge. So I put my 0 on the same edge that I had up here. I do that on the bottom too. I'm going to connect these lines, but notice I don't get a full inch over on this side, and that means that if I start on the wrong side, I'll get skewed lines. You need to make sure that you're anchoring on the same line, both for left and right, and when you're working your marks for top to bottom, make sure that you start your 0 on the same edge. Okay? So I've already made those marks. I'm going to connect them carefully. I'll try to be precise with my alignment here. I'm just pulling a thin Sharpie line across, and it kind of feels like I'm defiling the image. I do want to be careful. Okay, so I've got a grid overlaid on my print, and feel pretty good that I didn't mess it up too badly. If something goes terribly wrong, you can send another print. Now, those were 1 inch marks, and I'm going to scale up. I'm thinking about the size of my canvas. This paper takes up a good portion of my canvas. So I'm going to try to max out this paper. Now, my canvas is a square, and I won't fit everything on the canvas. I'll be making some decisions later on about that. But for now, I want to try to figure out how do I scale up so that the same number of squares, approximately, fits on this piece of paper. So, artists do math. I'm going to measure this. And you know what? I'm going to make a judgment call. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and about 3/4. But I'm going to say, judging my image, there's a lot of empty space out here. So I'm going to choose to eliminate some of the outside, and I'm only going to be using 6 squares wide. Okay, so just as a reminder, I'm going to eliminate out here. Now, why can I do that? Because I'm the artist. And this is a study. We're not making a replica. We're not forgers, which is good. So I'm choosing that I'm going to study this area. So I'm going to make a diagram here. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, now this is not for scale, this is just for thinking. All right, so I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns. Okay? And in this case, that's 6 inches wide. All right, now the height I'm not going to worry about. That's enough to get me started. And if I look at this paper, it's 17, make sure I've got a good registration here. This is about 17 and a half. Okay, so I'm penciling this in. This is 17 and a half. And you see I've got a different scale at the top than I have at the bottom. Okay, so this is the scale for my printout. This is the scale for my page. And importantly, it's in pencil because I can change that. I can choose how much of my page I'm going to use. So we can do this different ways. You can use division. You can use, your calculator, mathematics. I'm going to use trial and error and just ask myself, if I take 6 times 2, so if I make 2-inch squares, that gives me 12 inches across. If I take 6 times 3, so if I make 3-inch squares, that gives me 18 inches across. Okay, so now I make a judgment call. This is 17 and a half wide, and maybe I don't need that full square. So I'm going to say 3 is good. Now you can be more precise. You can get it down to decimals or fractions and try to really hit that number. But for my purposes, I'm focused on drawing, not on the math. So the math gets me as far as I need to go, and I'm just going to say 3 inches is good. I'll do the exact same process I did before. I'll mark these with pencil. But now I've just made the determination how big is the grid on the paper. They are 3-inch marks now. So 3, 6, 9, 12. Make sure that you know where 0 is on your ruler. This one is not at the end. Okay, and I hit 16 here. I don't want to get in the way of the camera. But then it hangs off a little bit. So I'm going to lose a little bit of the image. And I've already decided in my head, okay, so you need to think about what equals what. This mark equals the edge of this page. And then I'm marching over and making my marks. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and here I get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And 6 is here off the page. Okay, so now I'm just thinking, if I lose this much, in this case, it's no big deal. I'm not worried about it. So I'm just going to proceed with that, and we'll do 3-inch marks. And this little calculation here, you don't have to erase that, it doesn't matter. Maybe you want to, that's fine too. Just remember, what's the point? What are we actually doing here? Now notice I've made my marks at the far edges, and that, your ruler has to be able to reach, but you do want your marks to be as far apart as you can make them. This is the kind of project that has so many steps. And they sort of compound on each other. So, if I get the grid wrong here or wrong here, that has kind of a chain reaction. It affects the next step. So you want to make those marks accurate, confidently. Okay, and now I'm going to make the same marks here and live dangerously. We're just going to see where we end up, how many this affords us. Of course, you can measure, you can calculate. It's all kinds of cliches and jokes about artists. Well, see, I wasn't concentrating. About how they can't do math. And I guess I'm fulfilling that by making that mistake right there. But you know what? Everybody has different strengths. Okay, so make my marks on the opposite side in the same way. But don't believe that you have to be bad at math to be an artist. This is something that can be a very damaging assumption. For example, Leonardo, our subject, the artist that we're working on today, was a tremendous mind, tremendous scientist, engineer, artist, poet, musician. So, you know, I guess the point of what I'm saying is, don't feel like you have to limit yourself. You can be more than one thing. You can be good at more than one thing. Sometimes we struggle just because we tell ourselves we should. See, and this is wrong. I can tell. And I guess that's good for you to see. I'm going to make a correction there. But after I start drawing the grid, you know, this is obviously not a square. So I suppose let's take care of that right away. Okay, so something went wrong here. And this is a perfect illustration of what I was saying earlier, that the problems compound. So I want to take care of this as soon as possible. All right, so I didn't make a 3-inch mark. Yeah, I made a 4-inch mark. So let's get that back, bring it back. I love it when I make mistakes because, especially for students to see, because I think it's, you know, it's important to realize that even if something's filmed, you know, sometimes we have this impression that everything goes perfectly for everybody but me. And you can have that idea that it's effortless for the people that you see. It's not effortless. And you do have to pay attention to what you're doing. So every now and then, sit back, look at your work and ask, does that make sense? Is everything looking right? And just check your work. Okay, that's looking better. Now, what have we done? We've basically set ourselves a system that will assist us, but always remember what the final goal is. We're making a painting. We're not making a grid, we're not making a drawing, we're making a painting. So all of this is preparation work to get to the painting. Let's see how many vertical grid lines we ended up with. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.5 blocks. What does that get us here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.5 blocks. Okay, that's going to cut me off kind of right in the middle of the hand. We get the whole ermine head. Or I could work from more of the hand and take away some of the top. So this is being present. I'm going to try again. I'm going to start here from the top of the head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.5 gives me the whole hand. And up to like ermine bicep. So I'm going to do that. think I'm going to make that decision. Okay, so, this is important too. I made these grid lines and you might think, whoa, that was a waste. You're not going to use them. No, it's not a waste. You're affording yourself the ability to make editing decisions. Okay? You think about writing a paper and then cutting it down. You gather first and then you edit. Okay, so I'm going to count down again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and a half. I believe my cutoff line is here. I just want to double check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and a half ish, ballpark. Okay, so just to remind myself, I'm going to make a freehand line here. Living dangerously, I didn't mark it. Okay, and then that eliminates this from the image. Okay, so we're kind of focused now on the action, on the parts that have our subject. All right, now why a grid? I haven't really explained why I'm doing what I'm doing. The grid serves as a way to sort of check your work. So proportions are really the heart of a good drawing or a good painting. Sometimes people think that it's about details. And details are important. I don't want to discount their importance. But the thing that makes us recognize a figure or a face or anything from nature that we've seen before, it's really the proportions that make us see that. Okay, so a grid helps to keep us in check. It gives us sort of checkpoints, boundaries, and we want to check that everything is sort of staying where it should be. So I'm going to find this point where the top of the head is tangent to the edge of the page, and that's a good place for me to kind of start. That is, go from this side. 1, 2, 2 3/4 in. 1, 2 3/4 in. Okay, so that instantly gave me a place to find my spot, and if I look over to the left, I can kind of make myself a constellation here of destinations. Where should my lines be crossing these boundaries? All right, so now I'm moving kind of fast. I'm working my eyes around the boundary here and making myself a dot to dot. I used to love doing dot to dots. I used to love all the cheater things like dot to dots, or there were these pages that were preloaded with watercolor. You just take a brush with water and kind of brush the water over. Because as a kid, that was instant gratification. That was so cool. And dot to dots had that same appeal for me. You get to see a picture emerge, and you didn't have to work very hard at it. Now, now we're artists, and we're willing to work harder, aren't we? Now, notice what I'm doing. I'm starting with the edge. I'm working the perimeter. And you don't necessarily have to use this constellation approach. In fact, this is the first time I've ever done it this way. It just seemed like the right thing to do here. Because it moves you around. The nice thing about this is that it moves you around the whole page. I think you should be a little bit nervous or watch if you get stuck in a particular region while you ignore the rest of the page. especially at the beginning, you need to make some pretty quick progress. All right, now I'm putting in some lines here, and you can't just connect the dots. That's not what this is. They're sort of checkpoints along the way, but you do have to be paying attention, and you want to make graceful lines that are informed by the model. Okay, so the dots don't tell the whole story, and they don't allow you to just go on autopilot. That's not what they're there for. Okay, so you do need to pay attention to what you're doing. That's going to be a theme in all my instruction. Autopilot, this sort of shutting off of the mind, is something you might regret. It gets you into trouble. Later on, you have to really dig yourself out of a hole if you shut off your mind and if you're not paying attention to what you're doing. But take a look already. This is starting to give the impression of an outline. And I don't necessarily trust it, but I have to get it down on the page so that I can question it. All right, now I'm gonna find some more strong outlines. So that was the perimeter of the whole figure. I'm gonna go interior now and try to find some main, we'll call them landmarks. So a hairline here. When I'm looking for a landmark, I'm looking for something that's high contrast. Okay? It's tempting to think kind of Mr. Potato Head style and think, okay, where's the nose end and where are the eyeballs? But for an artist, that's not what we're really looking for. We're looking for the contrast. We're looking for the optics. What do our eyes tell us? Okay, so from the hair to the face, that's a strong contrast, and it's very particular to this picture, to this model. I'm not looking for what I think will be there. I'm looking for what actually is there. Okay, this pearl necklace, this string of pearls, I'm going to generalize it. I don't want to get into it yet. I just want to find the path of it, the general direction of it. I know there's more, and I'll get to it later. Okay, so the instant gratification question, you have to, I think, put off some of that gratification. You need to be able to hold it at arm's length and say, no, I'm not going to do the detail yet. I'll get to that later. That's an important skill, to be able to delay your gratification. And really what it's about is extended imagination, the ability to concentrate for extended periods of time. Don't forget what I'm doing here. This is starting to formulate, but remember, I'm checking against the grid. I'm constantly comparing back and forth, looking for border crossings, really. If the grid is like counties or states, I'm looking for, where these lines, maybe they're highways, Where do the highways cross the border? And, in between those crossings, there's a little wiggle, a little curve, and then I cross the border again. And all of that can be refined in the future. See, here's a correction. This is not an appropriate distance. So plan for corrections. Just know that you're going to come back to it. That's that delayed gratification. You're not going to get it right the first time. Don't expect it. Just expect to keep moving. You keep progressing. Okay, the edge of this hand is a strong contrast, strong outline, so it's definitely something I want to pay attention to. Just check those border crossings. Now, eventually, we do want this to be very accurate. Don't think that I'm giving permission to be sloppy. I'm just giving permission to be human. And now I'm gonna get rid of this calculation because now it's in my way. So we don't achieve perfection. We don't come at it as if we're perfect. However, we do chase excellence. We try hard. Okay, you don't have to get it the first time. That's an unnecessary pressure. With practice, you get better, and you'll be further along in your drawing process earlier in the process. Yeah, I'm making this look kind of easy. Don't be surprised if things are going to take you a little bit longer. More revisions, more erasing, something like that. That's totally understandable, and it's actually kind of the point. It's important that you go through that process of recognizing corrections that are necessary, recognizing flaws in your work. Sometimes we get delusional and we think that we don't make mistakes. All right, so, there's a sleeve here. I don't know if the camera's even going to pick it up. It's kind of dark on dark. And I haven't really drawn it in. My brain tells me there's a sleeve there, and I'm going to put it in there, but it's not, it's not a high contrast area. And I just want you to be aware that, the priority here is on the optics, not on what your brain tells you should be there, but on what your eyes tell you really is there. Okay, so there's kind of a fold here. There's a lot of folds and creases and drapery kind of information here. All of that's important, but I'm going to prioritize this contrasty line here because optically that's an important thing. Okay, so I need to locate where that's at. There's a point here right by a border, and then it kind of fades. All right, so I'm going to skip a lot of that soft, foldy stuff for now. We're going to come back to that in a later step. There's the same kind of situation here at the top of the ermine's head. Value-wise, her skin and the ermine's fur are almost identical, you know. So I decided to put that in because, I don't know, it felt like an important division between objects. But really, you know, paint-wise, there's not going to be that much of a difference in value, especially. There's a really important concept to learn from that, and that is lost and found edges. So sometimes you have sharp edges, and sometimes you have soft, kind of faded edges on objects. On the face, you can see very clearly this side of the face has a sharp, hard edge. There's high contrast where the light of the skin against the dark of the background is a very sharp, hard contrast. As you move around the head, that contrast diminishes because the figure in the hair gets dark and you lose the edge here. So you have a found edge and then a lost edge. And it comes back here, you get a found edge, and then it starts to fade and lose. So there's kind of a nice pattern. That's something for you to watch in your own work and in the work of others, that lost and found edge. Now I've done this whole figure without even touching the face. And that's kind of a it's kind of on purpose so that I don't get drawn into it too much. But I do need to address kind of some main points. So I don't want to get sucked into doing tiny details. I'm trying to keep my attention very broad. All right, so I'm just going to note the base of the nose. I'm going to look at the grid here and kind of note that an eyelid crosses at approximately that height. And then over here, which one's higher? You know, you do comparisons. The whole thing should work together. The whole thing should agree with itself. And agree with the grid. Now this mark tells me that the nose needs to be pulled back a little bit from the edge of the grid, so my note on the bottom of the nose is easy to correct because it's just a couple marks. If I were to make a perfectly rendered set of nostrils there and then realize that it needs to shift over, that's a lot of work to make that correction. So we've been looking for the high contrast boundaries, and we've kind of put some notes in for general positions of some features. And you know, one of the things I think you should learn to do is change what you're looking for. So I'm going to look at this now and try to find the boundary of the soft shadows. So now I'm intentionally looking for soft edges, and for example, you know, along the zygomatic arch, the cheekbone here, there's a transition from light to dark, and that sort of softly makes its way down to the chin and wraps around. Leonardo was a pioneer in this ability to softly move from light to dark, and really it sort of fades here. But I've changed what I'm looking for now. I'm looking for those borders within the form. I'm giving myself a new task to find that battleground between light and dark. And sometimes it's got hard edges and sometimes it doesn't. This is where I want you to start getting more specific. Theoretically, if you just draw or paint the shadows, the shapes of the shadows, everything else takes care of itself. And that can apply to the grid too. I'm looking for where this shadow on the eyebrow crosses the boundary. And this veil kind of gives me, if I find where that is, it kind of gives me another reference point so I can look at that shape of the shadow in the eyebrow and compare it to the veil. Okay, so I've changed what I'm looking for. That's one of the skills you should be nurturing, being able to essentially control your vision. So this is where I get a little bit more specific than I was earlier. I've made notes and now I'm expanding on those notes, but in a certain way. I'm looking for the boundaries of the shadows. And I know that things are more complicated than what I'm noting here. It's sort of a crude thing to just make these harsh marks for soft boundaries. But once again, it's a start. We'll come back to it and have plenty of more opportunities to change it later. Sometimes these things don't make sense, and that's not what this is about. This is not about what makes sense. It's about, what do I see? Okay, so I've started earlier here. I've started to note the boundary of this knuckle, and there's a slight plane change here on the fingers. Faces are hard, hands are almost as hard. And that's where it's nice to be able to sort of sidestep the subject and not think about drawing faces or hands or fingers. Don't think that you're drawing anything nameable. You're just recording your observations, looking for certain kinds of contrast. The fingers have shadows within themselves, okay? So on the knuckle, or as the form sort of turns away from the light, it starts to hide from the light. We start to see shadows. But then there's also shadows that the fingers cast on the ermine. Okay, so there's shadows that the fingers cause outside of themselves. That's kind of a different classification. It's all when you boil it down, it's all dark and light. I'm going to reiterate this boundary because I know I'm going to add some lines that could be confusing. Very subtle change here at the pit of the neck, which is an important landmark, meeting of the collarbone and the neck muscles and the sternum. It's barely visible. Now I can get into some of these folds in the drapery. I just called them folds, but really it's just these puddles of dark and light and finding where do they separate. What are the boundaries? The value of working like this is that this will be easy to transfer to canvas. These lines, we're just going to trace these lines. And they're notes for the paint. Remember, we're doing a painting. Okay, so it feels like we're doing a drawing, but it's all preparation for a painting. And this is all going to get us a good map for the painting. The drawing is, it sort of takes some of the weight off of the task of painting. The more prepared your drawing is, the less you really have to expend your brain power as you're painting. We're dividing the tasks out here. So if we do some of this value finding at this stage, then that's relieving pressure later. We don't have to do that work as we're trying to figure out what color and what direction do we put the paint on. Some of that thinking was done earlier. It's preparation, just being prepared. Sometimes people will ask, how do you draw? And then fill in the blank, any subject. So I'm working on an animal right now. Somebody might ask, well, how do you draw animals? The answer is always the same. All that I'm doing here is separating light and dark. I'm trying to find proportions, angles, contrast. How do you draw cars? How do you draw buildings? How do you draw people, faces, animals? It's all the same. It's all just drawing light and dark and angles and lines. I think you get in trouble when you start thinking that there's a secret, that there's shortcuts. The principles are consistent. So this line right here, I think, is an interesting case. It lines up very cleanly with the grid, this vertex. It's kind of three different lines that meet at one point. And I'm going to do a little revision here. I'll show you what I had before. My initial line was a little bit straight. It kind of goes directly from boundary to boundary. And what I see here is far more graceful. There's an elongated S curve that's happening that doesn't care about the grid. And I want you to be looking for those graceful examples where, you know, we do want to kind of obey the grid, but we also want grace. We want the lines to flow and dance and not look stilted. The grid doesn't matter to the painting. It helps us, but the grid is not our master. So I'm going to change my vision now. You know, I've been talking about switching your vision. Now I'm looking for places where I can go back and refine and extend and kind of reclaim the grace. And it's a subtle thing. And where I was hesitant before, you know, I'm going to start to be a little bit more forceful with committing at this point and trying to remind my later self about the grace. In order to get these graceful lines, it's really important. Notice that I'm moving my arm, not my fingertips. This is a relatively large piece of paper, and sometimes we're sort of stuck in a handwriting pose. But if you can keep your sort of move from your elbow instead of from your knuckle joints, it's a little easier to get that grace. It takes practice. Now notice I'm holding the pencil in different ways too. If you always hold it kind of like you're doing penmanship, and if you really hold it close to the point, that kind of control actually works against a graceful line. Sometimes I see people doing lines like this sort of jagged line. Make it your goal to make your line like a stretched rubber band. So it's got this long, graceful curve. It should continue to be informed. It's not just swoopy to be swoopy. You want it to have this grace not only in the drawing, but eventually in the painting. So these things compound, and you need to be able to sort of keep it at the forefront of your mind the whole time. It's hard to detect out here in the lost edge and the shadow. And eventually the values will take care of that, and it won't really be visible. Okay, that's good for now. I'm going to move over to the canvas in a little bit, but before I do that, I want to show you a method for us to be able to trace this. So I've got the drawing pretty firmly established on the front here. I'm going to flip this over and use that vine charcoal that I mentioned and coat the whole back with vine charcoal. And this is going to be a messy process. But what it essentially does is it creates a carbon paper to the backside of this so that we can apply pressure to the drawing and transfer it to the canvas. I'll show you what I mean. I only need this where the drawing is, so I don't need to cover the whole page. I can kind of see through a little bit. I'm just going to apply this where I need it. Make sure to get good coverage. And this is going to burn up a couple charcoal sticks. Again, I'm using vine charcoal. I kind of find the edges first and then know that everything inside those edges needs to get filled. All right, so this is just a stub now. Get another one. This drawing will be forever messy to store. You can store it with a sheet if you plan to keep this, like a cover sheet that you tape, a piece of newsprint or something, or you could seal the backside with some fixative. There are alternatives to this method. You could buy several sheets of carbon paper, which are also pressure sensitive transfer tools. Usually they come in 8.5 by 11. You might find it in a roll, kind of like plastic wrap or wax paper in a roll. That's carbon paper that you're looking for. But this is sort of the cheap, always available way. It's very dusty. so there's consequences to it. Okay, so I've got my charcoal on the back. We're going to move over to the easel, and I'll show you how we transfer it. We're going to need some tape. Okay, so I'm here at the easel now, and I've got our drawing with our charcoal on the back taped just at the top so that there's a hinge at the top. And that allows me to trace lines and then lift up to check my work. So here's a line that I traced, and you can see even on the back side that it's pressed the paper into the canvas and transferred some of that charcoal to the canvas. Now it's not real stable, that line can go away. So you do have to be delicate with this. I've chosen to drop the paper a little bit below the edge so that this top of the head isn't right at the edge. So I'm redrawing. I've redrawn this several times now. And every time matters. I've redrawn several times, and yet it's a painting. We're working on generating a painting. It's going to take some time here. My calculation worked out pretty well here. I've got a little bit of paper hanging over the edge, and that is okay because I say it's okay. I'm not copying my grid. Okay, so grid lines don't get transferred here. I'm trying to remain faithful to the lines and graceful. Long extended lines. I'm also trying to make sure that I don't buckle the paper so that it stays where it should be. Can check the work every now and then. It's starting to work, starting to show. And these boundaries of the shadows will become important places for paint. Those are boundaries we're going to use with the values of the paint. But they're just notes. It's a painting. So I'm going to put these down as faithfully as I can, and then later on, I will insist on not trusting myself. But I need to be as trustworthy as I can be every stage. Hopefully without fussing about it so much that I'm stalled and that I don't make progress. It's a tricky balance. I want to be careful that I don't rub my hands on the paper too much I just want to be transferring at the tip of the pencil. And I'm trying to keep track, too, of lines that I've drawn, lines that I haven't drawn. So every now and then I'll lift up the paper. But that charcoal on the back of this paper is delicate, and it will all fall off if you treat the paper too roughly. And that's what we want. We want it to be able to come off, but only where we tell it to. So my mind is occupied right now with trying to do this mechanical job well so that I get a good transfer. And that means I don't have a lot of brain space for choosing where the lines should be. That's already been done. That's the advantage of dividing out your work, doing some of your work before you get to the canvas. Because now I can be drawing and talking at the same time, and be fairly confident in the results. Because right now I'm just doing a mechanical process. I'm just transferring. I don't have to do a lot of decision making at this point. If I drew it before, I'll draw it again. And that is enough for me to think about now. It's plenty to focus on doing a good job of this, just like I was focusing on doing a good job of the decision making back at the drawing table. So we can break up the work into stages and make it more manageable for ourselves. Now, very importantly, before I remove this paper, I really want to make sure that I'm done with it, because to re-register it, to get it back into position, will be pretty much impossible, pretty difficult to get it back where I need it to be. But there is enough information here for me to start a drawing. So I'm going to take this off and set it aside carefully. If I tap this surface, little bits of charcoal fly off. So it's fragile. It's transferred, but it's fragile. So I'm going to suggest spraying the surface with a workable fixative or some kind of a fixative, just to kind of hold those dust particles in place. You don't need to soak the surface. Just a little mist will hold those a little bit nicer. Okay, next time we'll get to painting.